The measure of intelligence is the ability to change.
Hi all, Dr. Clark here, and for this lecture we're going to talk about biological themes. So remember, we're laying down the groundwork or the background, the baseline for examining current issues in biology. And one of that kind of overarching or groundwork that kind of covers a lot of current issues is biological themes. There are biological themes that are connected to basically all subject material. So let's say we're talking about the ecology of a butterfly. We are going to talk about the evolution of that butterfly. So we talk about something like this. This shows the connections, the genetic connections between all butterflies. Okay, so this is an evolutionary chart showing that connectivity. That might be important if we're looking at cooperation, competition, different interactions between different groups of butterflies in a given region. Over here, we might be looking at a certain species of butterfly, and that feeds on the nectar of a certain species of thistle. Okay. That plant is an autotroph. That butterfly is a heterotroph. Okay. And we're going to look at flow of energy, another biological theme. Okay, so as we go through these different examples or different things that we see in biology today, important issues, important topics, lying underneath those or in the background are all these biological themes that connect those kind of ideas. So we're going to go through these biological themes, and you can get an idea of when I start talking about different things, like maybe we're talking about viruses. So we might use one of the biological themes, talk about evolution of viruses. We might use another biological theme. We might talk about, whether or not viruses do homeostasis, whether or not viruses have flow of energy. These different pieces will come up in the conversation when we talk about viruses. Okay, so let's talk about one that we've already discussed a little bit. Okay, that's evolution. Remember, evolution is genetic change in a population over time, okay, and that population will be a certain species. Okay, and evolution, that change over time, it can lead to speciation. It can lead to the separation of two populations and having one elevated to a species and the other one remaining as the original species. It can lead to that, and we'll talk about ways at which that can happen. If you remember, I already discussed that evolution was not created, evolution was not invented, evolution was discovered. Okay? But it was discovered by many, many individuals and had been around for a very long time prior to Charles Darwin. So the term evolution and the documentation of change, not genetic, because in the 1800s we didn't know there was such thing as genetics, but change in a species over time was documented many times prior to Charles Darwin. The problem with that documentation prior to Charles Darwin was that the mechanisms that were used to explain it. There were no good mechanisms to explain it. There were some where, like, a higher being is doing the changing. Another one was like, organisms adapt by, acquiring characteristics, and they pass those acquired characteristics on to the next generation. This is what we call Lamarckian ideas, or Lamarckian evolution. Okay, so there was a lot of misconceptions around evolution. Darwin came along, he developed a mechanism for evolution that he called natural selection. Okay? He also developed a mechanism for evolution he called sexual selection, and he was part of a group that developed a mechanism called artificial selection. So when we talk about evolution, it's not just those three types of, mechanisms. There are quite a few other mechanisms that Darwin didn't know anything about that can also lead to evolution. Right? And we'll discuss these in greater detail in the future. We know, though, that evolution itself, or this ability for organisms to change over time, is the reason why we have a high diversity of life on the planet. Right? Is that organisms are adapting to their environment. We know that environments change, therefore organisms either change or they go extinct. Those are really the two main options you got. Either you change or you go extinct. All right, let's talk about flow of energy. So flow of energy is the basis around one of those key themes to whether or not something is alive. We know that all living organisms require energy. Now they can get that energy in different forms. We've already talked about that. Autotroph versus heterotroph, chemosynthesis versus photosynthesis. But for the most part, when we talk about flow of energy on this planet, the majority of organisms are directly connected to photons, okay, or the energy that comes from sun. So the photon or light energy that's coming from the sun is where that direct connection is to the majority of living organisms. There are a few organisms that live like near heat vents in the ocean, way away from the light, that are doing chemosynthesis, and they have their own kind of food web that's connected to them. But by and large, most things directly interact with organisms that have picked up energy that's been converted from photons. Again, we've already talked about how organisms acquire energy, that it's different for different organisms. How much energy they get, right? That differs by different organisms. Again, I can't, talk enough about this. When we start discussing ecology, when we start talking about environmental disruption or environmental issues, flow of energy is hugely important. Okay? If you're deforesting, you're removing primary producers at an alarming rate, and you're going to affect your food web. So we'll look at these kind of issues and see if environments can recover with a different type of primary producer, or does it change the entire food web? Okay, we'll look at these. And this basically is exactly what flow of energy is talking about. Organisms acquire energy differently. The other key component to this is how energy works, how energy moves, and what happens to the energy. So we know, and we'll talk more about photosynthesis. Okay, we know that how photosynthesis works, what's the products of photosynthesis. And then we know that organisms can consume those products, but what do those organisms do with those products? And where's that energy going? We'll look at energy food pyramids, okay? And we'll look at the transfer of energy from primary producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers to tertiary consumers, etc. Where's the flow of energy? How much energy is lost between each group? We'll look at those as we progress also. Cooperation is another biological theme. Okay, and cooperation can work in a few different ways. This theme is really about interactions between organisms, okay? Interactions between groups of organisms. Sometimes cooperation turns into competition. Sometimes cooperation is mutualistic. Sometimes cooperation is parasitic. Okay? And we're going to look at these interactions between groups of organisms. So cooperation is 99% of the time is directly tied to biological theme number 2, which is flow of energy. Because energy is a limited resource, right? Except for in developed countries, often energy is not limited, but we'll get to kind of issues with not having limited resources in developed countries, and those underdeveloped countries having limited resources. We'll kind of talk about how that works. Okay, but when we talk about animal kingdom, plant kingdom, fungi kingdom, these groups of organisms are limited by the energy available to them. Or they might be limited by a certain resource, maybe a certain mineral, precipitation, certain amount of sunlight. Okay, they might be limited by some other resource. And it's that limitation that really drives cooperation. It drives some level of cooperation. And now, that level of cooperation could be symbiosis, where both organisms are benefiting from the interaction. But it also could be that cooperation could be turned from a symbiotic relationship, or one that might have been symbiotic relationship, into a parasitic relationship. And we'll look at how we determine whether or not something is actually symbiosis, or is it mutualism, or is it parasitism. We'll look at these different examples as we progress. All right, so the symbiosis is when two species interact directly with each other. A great example of this is this symbiosis that's going on between this creature here and this creature here. Okay? This is a termite. Okay? This is the intestinal tract. There's the gut, okay, of a termite. If you look inside the gut of that termite, you'll see this organism, which is a species of bacteria, a beneficial species of bacteria that has the capability of breaking cellulose bonds. Okay? So when we look at wood fiber, or when we look at wood itself, wood is made of cellulose, which is a carbohydrate, but it's formed in a very different way with different bonds. And it's these bonds in this different structure that makes cellulose rigid and allows for trees to grow really tall, okay, and have a massive body to that plant. Well, that rigid structure is also, that chemical formation is also very difficult to break down. And there are very few organisms that have the capability of consuming cellulose and utilizing it as an energy resource. Okay, again, this goes back to kind of that flow of energy. One of those organisms is this bacteria that occurs in the gut of termites. If we gave a termite an antibiotic, okay, that kills off this bacteria, the termite would starve to death, because this bacteria alone is the reason why the termite can eat wood. It's the reason why the termite can consume cellulose, break it down, down into simpler sugars and utilize those sugars as an energetic source. Without it, there's no way. They can't get the energy from the wood fibers. Now, you might ask, well, what's in it for the bacteria? Well, it just happens to be that the bacteria is established in the gut of a termite. It's established in that ecosystem. So it has a certain pH that it can withstand. It has a certain interaction with other digestive enzymes that don't disrupt the bacteria. And if you remove the bacteria and try to allow for it to grow on its own, it can't do it. Okay, so it's getting feedback from the gut. It's getting that ecological habitat, which we often call an ecological niche, okay, from the gut of the termite. And I know some of you might be thinking, okay, so you have this termite and you have this beneficial bacteria in their gut. Which one came first? It's, that old age question, chicken or the egg? Okay? Which one came first? We really don't know. The odds are pretty good that termites, or the line of termites, prior to consuming, almost 100% wood as a diet, they probably ate a different diet. And maybe they consumed other plant material, fruity material, seeds, leafy material that has cellulose in it, but not completely cellulose. So they could get, glucose and starches and fructose and things like that. They could get other sugars from the plant material, but then this beneficial bacteria evolved. Right? Either it evolved in an environment where it didn't need the gut habitat of the termite, or it actually evolved in the gut of a given termite or a few termites, etc. And that gave termites a distinct advantage on eating wood fiber. So you might ask, well, how do they pass it on then? Because it's not genetic. It's not in their genes. There's not a bacteria gene that, these termites are passing on. Termites pass this on to their offspring. Because when termites give birth to their offspring, they regurgitate food into their offspring's mouth, or next to their offspring, so their offspring can consume it. That regurgitation has these beneficial bacteria with it. And so that would kind of add to that connection, that flow of energy, add to that cooperation. Now all these organisms have these beneficial bacteria inside them. We'll look at some other examples of situations that this has occurred in. Okay, structure determines function. This is an important one. This ties us right back to evolution, that first theme that we talked about. Structures that we see develop in nature, they have a certain functions that it allows the organism to do. Now, maybe that functionality is not what that structure had done in the past. So, maybe having a certain feature, maybe having a certain color, having a certain patch of feathers, having a certain, size of tail, or something along these lines. Maybe at one time that structure was more beneficial, and that structure was utilized in a different fashion. And then today, maybe that structure still exists in a different form and might have a total different function today. Maybe it has no function at all. So if you think of things like our tailbone, our coccyx, Is it harmful to us? No. Does it have a use? No. And so when we look at it, we would consider that structure a vestigial characteristic, a characteristic that's left over from prior ancestral connections. Okay? If you go far enough back, our ancestors had tails. Okay? And so if you look at all the primates, that they don't have tails, but they have cocci. They have that bone. It's still there. Okay? So if you look at a chimpanzee, there's no tail, okay? But they have a coccyx just like we do. Okay? And so you have this connection. Now, on top of that, when we start looking at structures, we'll start talking about the evolution of that structure. Again, maybe it started off as 99 to 100% of the time, it starts out off as a malformation, a mutation. The first organism to develop feathers, that was a mutation of scales. We know that because we can reverse it. We can genetically change a few mistakes and get a chicken that has no feathers and it's just all scales. And we'll talk more about kind of these details later. But we know that mutation occurred, developed feathers. Maybe at first feathers had nothing to do with flight. Okay, most biologists and most paleontologists believe that it had nothing to do with flight at first. It had everything to do with thermal regulation or maintaining a body temperature. Then those feathers developed longer feathers, more aerodynamic feathers, and could allow for organisms to glide better and eventually fly. Okay? So you can see that structures, how the structures develop, are determining some kind of function. The other thing that we often see is that these structures are similar to other organisms, but they don't develop in the same manner. And so let's talk about like fins and flippers, okay, and aerodynamics of organisms that swim. Okay. For the most part, most fish, most marine mammals, okay, most organisms that swim at constant velocities or swim in general for long distances, they're all fusiform in shape, torpedo in shape. Majority of them have some type of fin. Okay? Whether we call that a fin or a flipper, the structure is the same. It's like a paddle in the water. Now, fish didn't give rise to marine mammals. Marine mammals came from the land. Marine mammals were land mammals that went into the water and developed flippers. So they reduced their limbs, these limbs that they were walking on land with, eventually became reduced through many mutations. They started developing flippers. The first flippers were probably nothing more than extra flaps of skin on limbs, but then eventually that gave them a distinct advantage. They could swim faster. If you could swim faster, you can get more resources, evade predators, reproduce more. Those flaps of skin were passed on. Those flaps of skin got longer, the digits got smaller, okay, and eventually you get into this fusiform flipper organism, like whales and dolphins and porpoises and other things. Okay? That's called convergent evolution. Fish did not give rise to marine mammals, but they converged on the same body form and the same, fin structure. Now, fish fins are made of a bunch of rays, little teeny bones, for the most part. Little teeny bones that come through. Now, there are lobe fin fishes also that are just fat that's attached to a bone, okay? And then you have flippers, which is fat and skin that is attached to bones underneath. Okay? But the same digits are underneath as modern digits of land mammals, okay? So land mammals, 5-digit, if you look at a porpoise's, underneath a porpoise's flipper, okay, a dolphin's flipper, and the 5 digits still remain. Right? We'll look at convergent evolution in much greater detail because it shows a lot of examples of this structure function, because there are structures on this planet that are advantageous. And the ability to fly involves basically wings, and wings are developed the same. They look the same regardless of whether you're a butterfly, a dragonfly, a bird, a bat. Okay? The flaps, the wing dynamics, the aerodynamics are very, very similar, even though they're not even close to developing the same way. Okay? I mean, when we look at insects, they don't even have bones, so they're just fluid-filled tubes that allow for scales to be attached to those tubes and stretched out to make a wing. Okay, again, we'll come back to this. Homeostasis. Homeostasis is maintaining a constant, and when I say constant, that means, in this case, a constant range of internal environments. Okay? Steady state. It doesn't mean that it has to be a single temperature or a single level of, salinity, or a single level of nitrogen in the system, or a single level of iron in your blood. It doesn't mean that you have a single number. It means that you have a steady number. You have a range at which your body maintains that range. Okay? And we know this because all organisms have these control systems that will control this homeostasis environment. Okay? When we get thirsty, we know it. Okay? You feel thirsty. You'll get to a point where, that thirst goes away and you start, developing a headache because water is being taken from different regions of your body. Okay, your eyes will start going blurry if you're really dehydrated because water is being removed from your eyes. Your lips will start to crack. Eventually, they'll start to bleed, right? Because these cells are being scuffed off so fast because the water is being pulled away from them that you will start having your skin crack, right? Because the water is going to the core of your system. And it's going to your heart to keep that going. But think about homeostasis in a plant. Most of us know if a plant needs water, its leaves will start to wilt. Okay, because again, the water's being ripped out of those areas that are, external or out there. So, as in a human, first things to go is kind of your fingers and your toes and things like that. That's where the water's coming out of. Your eyes, your head, and it's going to the core. Well, in a plant, it's coming out of the leaves and the stems, and it's going to the roots. Because if the water can be maintained in the roots, then the plant can give off another shoot if there's enough energy that's being stored in the roots of that organism. So once the water returns, it could regenerate a shoot, okay? If the material above it is dead. Okay? But it's still homeostasis for both organisms. This internal environment is, really it's a fairly stable environment. Right? And there's a lot of checks and balances on that environment. Okay? If you don't have enough salt, you'll know it. If a butterfly doesn't have enough salt, they'll know it. Right? Their system, their body lets them know, look, you don't have enough of this nutrient. You don't have enough of this, whatever it might be. Okay? Water. You don't have enough sunlight. You don't have enough, you have too much heat. Okay? These different things, okay, will move the balance, the homeostatic balance, and make it so your physiological condition is off. And organisms have that ability to right themselves by consuming material, by moving into the shade, by seeking shelter, by moving up in a water column, down in a water column. There's lots of ways at which organisms behaviorally or innately change their homeostasis. Okay? So innate is genetic change. So, you get thrown out into -10 weather with nothing on. Okay? The first thing you're going to do is kind of curl up, and then you'll start shivering. Okay? And none of that is you. Okay? You're not consciously saying, I'm going to shiver now. It's your body firing muscles to maintain body temperature. It's your body utilizing stored energy to try to maintain core body temperature. All right, so we're going to stop there and pick up on how scientists think.